Panelists on the line. When you are ready to begin the presentation, press the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to our last session studying Work, Sex and Money by the Vidyadhara, the Venerable Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And I hope I've done justice to the subject matter, and I certainly come with a lot of, you could say, awe with regards to this work. And I think I mentioned last time, I think somehow in presenting Buddhism in our particular context, modernity, Asian modernity, Western modernity, there are certain classics, and this is one of them. I was thinking we very often when it comes to introducing Buddhism, we'll speak about cutting through spiritual materialism, myth of freedom. And I particularly think this one here is appropriate for those who are in contact with the Vajrayana world, because you here have a truly sensitive presentation of what Vajrayana requires in the modern world. You really have an overview of the way that Vajrayana views the reality around us as workable, and the inspiration that lies at the basis of Vajrayana, of course, is the general, you could say, foundations, the foundations of mindfulness, compassion, awareness, and so on. But then again, there's a particular flavor and a particular way of, you could say, fearlessly engaging with our world that is very much reflected in the Vajrayana approach, and which is represented in this present work. And particularly the last chapter today really reflects a Vajrayana approach. So I hope that in presenting this material, I could do somewhat justice to this extremely important work. And I hope that all of you will continue to study this again and again. As you know, you can study a teaching again and again and again, because every time we've gained some experience, you could say we've tested what we read first time, and then we come back, and again we can see the layers that we can appreciate further through second, third reading, and so on. Okay. Regarding money, regarding money as mother's milk, we can celebrate the idea of money. It creates and allows for growth. As we apply ourselves to the discipline of the path, we blossom. We also look after our world, and that requires money. So all of this is, you could say, a unit. Money, our development, our path, our discipline, the way that we care for others. And of course, what has been a recurrent theme here in this work is that we do sometimes think that, in particularly in a spiritual and counterculture context, that money is something negative, and we might even think it's antithetical to the path of awakening. And hopefully this discussion has eliminated a great deal of this sort of prejudice, compartmentalization of the path, and generally mistaken assumptions about the Buddhist path altogether. Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, he proposes that we view money as something creative, something that's like he said earlier, it's a bit like what we breathe. It's something that we can turn into something creative, something we celebrate. So as we practice the discipline of the path, we naturally perk up, we look after ourselves, and you could say the aspects of our life, such as money, become something that's highly workable. There's a lot of potential in it. And as we look after ourselves, we look after our world, we also then use money in our dealings with the world and in our caring for the world. When we feel good, we like to spend a little on having a good time. Spending can come with a ratna quality of extending our well-being and lack of poverty. We are contented, and that eliminates outer and inner poverty. We might appear wealthy. That comes from our practice of Dharma. So spending money on ourselves has a lot to do with being uplifted. You could say that spending money, we might have some, you could say, concerns. It can be a burden sometimes. It can also be a pleasure. So when we spend money, that richness that we bring to this spending is not just about the money itself, but it's also reflecting a freedom from psychological poverty. It doesn't have to be frivolous spending. It can have this, what Trungpa Rinpoche calls, ratna mentality. If you read the last chapter of Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, it talks about 5 families of, you could say, the awakened wisdom. And this is key to understanding Vajrayana. We sometimes also refer to these 5 as the 5 Buddha families. And Ratna is the wisdom of equality, where we feel so at ease in our world that there's also a sense of incredible wealth in it. So the Ratna family is associated with the wisdom of equality and also of wealth, richness, the flourishing of our lives. Ratna literally means jewel, and it is then a symbol of wealth, lack of poverty, and that is both psychological and it's both material and psychological. Actually, when we describe Ratna, it's so pervasive that we don't really distinguish between our material or external perception and our inner psychological experience. It's very much that these two are melded together. When Trungpa Rinpoche describes the 5 families, he does so very much in terms of describing external environment and also the psychological attitudes. Anyway, coming back to this lack of poverty, of course, as practitioners, we are in fact content. But then again, I think we quoted Nagarjuna and implicitly also Alfred Nobel, where we say the greatest of all wealth is contentment. And so as Buddhists, we are actually content with very little. But when we have that attitude, effectively this translates into a very joyous, exuberant even situation. We have something to give. So that's where people might think that we're wealthy, we might be elegant, we might look upbeat, well-groomed. But that is Ratna, and that is really more than anything a quality of practicing the path. There's a story about the Buddha who patched together these leftover pieces of cloth and ended up looking very elegant. The Buddha was elegant with this patched garment. Ratna is about basic sanity and worthiness, dignity. We might wear our clothes a few days and still look sharp. This is the reflection of merit, an awakened karma. So, with regards to the Buddha, in the book then Trungpa Rinpoche, he describes how Buddha sewed himself a robe from these rejected pieces of cloth. His being, and of course also this contented aspect of simply stitching together rejected cloth, projects then what it is that we're talking about. It's a projection of strength and wealth that comes without having to spend a lot of money, without any ostentatious display of wealth. And also, we don't necessarily need to be worrying that much about the externals. We could, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, wear our shirt a few days. We could maybe not change for a few days, and we could still look sharp. It's not about extravagance. We're also not here promoting anything in terms of, just wearing your clothes even though you might be needing to be washed. That's not at all the point. It's more about a quality. And that quality is associated with what we call merit. Merit, you could say, is, as Trungpa Rinpoche describes it, karma of basic sanity and worthiness, dignity. But it also is about, it's karma to some extent, but it's a particular kind of karma that's associated with awakening. So in that sense, you could say it's our merit then that effortlessly we, through connecting with the path, then we just appear well-groomed, upbeat, and so forth. In doing business, we can change existing patterns. It is a very good time to set up business overall. So in setting up business, we're not obliged to follow some of the existing patterns of cheating and evil practices, as we do find in the cultures that we inhabit crimes of the past that might be associated with some of the, you could say, ethos that prevails. I come from Denmark, which famously has a rather shady history of plundering, but that goes about 1,000 years back, so it's not really part of the existing ethos. Whereas in some places, like possibly North America and so on, there might still be an ethos of conquering the natives and so on. This is to some extent also prevalent in Denmark, where you have the impoverished and marginalized Eskimos that are part of, you could say, the colonial inheritance of Denmark. In Australia, they have the Aboriginals and so on. So there is these kind of, you could say, there's a karma that comes down. Trungpa Rinpoche also refers to the Spaniards like Cortez, that plundered Montezuma's empire and so on. And that can, to some extent, translate into some of the contemporary corporate malpractice. But then again, we needn't be governed by that, and we needn't be conditioned. We could change those existing patterns. Indeed, times are changing, and from that point of view, whenever we set out based on our motivation and our spirit, it is a very good time to set up business. We should take the attitude of wishing to benefit others with our business. Our business ethics should be thinking in terms of friendship. The money involved is like mother's milk. It nourishes us. It nourishes the others. We should take the attitude of wishing to benefit others with our business, which is a theme that Trungpa Rinpoche also spoke about earlier. We can identify so many different neurotic ways of dealing with business and our role within a corporate context or wherever we might be, and so on. And what really cuts through it is this quality of bodhicitta, the quality of beginning to think in terms of how could we benefit our community, our relatives, the others in our lives. These others in our lives then are brothers, sisters, friends, and with our business, with our money, our financial resources, we can benefit them. We can also influence our space, our region, our nation. So our business ethics should be thinking in terms of friendship, not setting up barriers between self and other, one-upmanship and so on. No matter what, we abandon the idea of cutting others' throats, and instead we cultivate tenderness. The money involved should be viewed as mother's milk. It's something that nourishes us. It nourishes the others. We respect its worth, and we're able to let it go. When there is such an attitude, it brings a dynamic of gratitude, non-aggression, and the wealth of mother's milk. Incidentally, I remember right now as I'm talking that Trungpa Rinpoche actually put out a unit, a monetary unit called a ratna. It looked very much like a standard coin, a little bit of a sort of jubilee, how do you say, edition, but it was, you could say, the endorsement of money, I guess you could say, and of course other things as well. I shan't pretend to fathom the depth of what was behind that, but I just remember that there was a coin that was put out in the context of Shambhala or the Vajradhatu called a ratna. The point is, no passion, aggression, ignorance, and not cheating anybody. We could propose to operate without old patterns. When there is more gentleness, more kindness, and more willingness to share with others, that brings tremendous gratitude, non-aggression, and the wealth of mother's milk. Also, as Trungpa Rinpoche says, the main point is not to borrow the habitual tendencies of passion, aggression, and ignorance, and not to cheat anybody. We're trying to establish a financial mandala, a financial world altogether. That world is not only a local world, but a vast world that we can share with others. We could propose to operate without old patterns and instead do business that is pure, open, and fresh. Of course, this sounds very Shambhalian, but this, and of course it is, but it is also basic to, you could say, the ethos of business in any Buddhist culture, any Buddhist context. Money provides opportunity for exploring the depth of the confused world. Working with money is working with the 12 nidanas, you could say the 12 links of dependent arising. It can be the foundation for the practice of the Bodhisattva's paramita vehicle. The thing is, money is a place that we share. It's a shared modality, a shared medium. Money brings people together. But it is then habitually associated with passion, aggression, and ignorance. So just like sex and work, it provides a wonderful opportunity for exploring the real substance of the confused world. This is not necessarily the objective confused world, it is our world. And we inhabit it and we infuse it, or we, you could say, purify it of confusion. And that's where the working with money, it allows us to work with how our confusion develops and also how it's diminished. And that is exactly the science of the 12 links of dependent origination, the 12 nidanas. Trungpa Rinpoche says, when you break the chain of the 12 nidanas, which come from greed, ignorance, and all the other expressions of our confusion, then you have a new situation based on generosity, discipline, patience, and the other bodhisattva activities, meaning the, end of quote, meaning then the 6 paramitas. Breaking this chain is also what we call reversing the nidanas. We can talk about, in Tibetan is luk jung and luk do. And jung means how they play out, starting from confusion and all the way up to old age and death. But we can also go back. We can also identify where this, you can say, we can work our way backwards, all the way back to the origins of confusion. And that is then reversing the nidanas. And that is what we effectively can do when we're dealing with money. Such an approach requires awareness of the existing knowledge and customs of our culture. Money as mother's milk requires integrity and morality. We can sustain the tradition of practice with our work and money. So the enlightened approach that's suggested here requires awareness of the existing knowledge and customs of our culture. We are, of course, different from the Asian culture. We're different from traditional Buddhist cultures, But at the same time, we know how our culture works, and with that knowledge, we can begin to identify again the development and the reversal of confusion. And that has so much to do with working step by step with people. And that's where the interaction then has fused with the presence of money, requires integrity and morality. And that's then where money is transformed. When we have those, then money becomes this thing that sustains us. It becomes the mother's milk. In that approach, there's no such a thing as easy money. It's just plain money that has to be gotten by honest, straightforward means. Practicing non-aggression, basically the absence of the three kleshas. So this is the spirit of doing something constructive within the wheel of existence. For those on the path, we are in samsara, and yet these conditions of samsara, we can transform them into conditions for enlightenment. We can do it, and we have to do it. This is choiceless. And in this, we have then the connection to the lineage. Our practicing this is the key to enlightenment, and it's also key to the survival of the practice lineage. Chapter 16. And by the way, let me just remind you, if there's anything here in the course of just this discussion, don't hesitate in writing your questions. Of course, having read the book, then possibly everything is clear. But anyway, here we are. We're together here. So if something is unclear, do write a question. Work, sex, and money might not gel with the classic view of pleasure-oriented spirituality. So we've been discussing this again and again. Some might object to including the aspects of work, sex, and money on the path. Some might think that there is a different kind of path which is about escaping the ugly and attaining pleasure, bliss, love, and light, where you can remain high on meditation and you can remain forever blissed out. You're pious and nice, and you don't get involved with all the, these dirty ingredients of work, sex, and money. So such persons, they are free men and women in a beautiful world. And that is then the classic view of what is essentially pleasure-oriented spirituality. It's a spirituality that conforms with our expectations, our wants, and you could say every sort of basic, simple instinct of the ego. It's essentially, the various kinds of materialism that we have here. Yes, it's spiritual materialism, but it also includes then material and psychological materialism. But it is particularly then actually it's not. It's not actually. It is essentially spiritual materialism, in which then one supposedly has transcended material and psychological materialism, but it's still, you could say, the root of material and spiritual and psychological materialism are still implicit in there. There's still that sense, and right now that sense of self is gratified through samadhi and being high on meditation. But lacking that, it'll want other objects, more gross objects, which is then when it's on the grosser level of the material and the psychological. So in this kind of spirituality, the path is seen as a shortcut to fulfillment, not subject to the actual work other pleasures require. If you're on the right side, the side of the good, you get what you want. Buddhism, on the other hand, begins in the empirical dimension of our existing experience. So, Trungpa Rinpoche says, Buddhism begins quite differently from other religions, in that it begins from an atheistic standpoint. The whole revelation and inspiration for the Buddhist path comes from pain, suffering. Then you look for the origin of suffering, you discover the possibility of the cessation of suffering, and then you discover the path. So where we live, amongst our ordinary peers, within our ordinary society, within our culture, everybody wants happiness. Everyone works to create the good karma that creates happiness. Everybody's fine with that. Yeah, you work, you get happy. Yeah. Yet when it comes to spirituality, which is this fishy, elusive, intangible entity, it's as if there's a belief that happiness through spirituality is to be reached by some sort of smart shortcut, that we could just figure it out and stay in some meditative state. We will have fulfilled all our desires in a transcendental way, of course, and any path could be turned into serving the side of the good, the light force versus the dark force. If you're on the right side, you get the pleasure you want. You're on the side of God, you're defeating Satan. So that we can see play out in so many different scenarios in the world, in all sorts of ways. Buddhism begins differently. It operates with the empirical reality of what we experience, our subjective experience of suffering. You work with the causes, you eliminate them, and you manifest cessation. But cessation is not based on sustaining something. It consists of eliminating a cognitive dysfunction, a cognitive mistake. So the path is about awakening. It's like when we go to the doctor is not just going to, sit there and beam out, I am so healthy, and all you need to do is just believe in me. The doctor very kindly is not concerned or self-conscious of the fact that he or she might be well. He just points to the fact you're ill right now, but your illness being curable, you then need to eliminate that illness, and then the doctor is not constructing our health. The doctor simply eliminates our illness, and the health takes care of itself. It manifests. So in that sense, on that path, there's nothing about us sustaining something. We're really just removing what it is that's external to our basic health, and health manifests. On the path of awakening, we're not sustaining some spiritual something or other. We just remove our confusion. We remove what keeps us asleep, and then we awake. So we could, of course, and then going back to this, the proposition of this pleasure-oriented spirituality, we could insure ourselves, seal ourselves off. But do we really want to go so far to avoid work, sex, and money? Perhaps we could try a higher approach that goes beyond the basic assumptions innate to such insecurity. So with the higher approach here, we are then talking about the Buddhist approach, which doesn't, you could say, subscribe to this poverty-stricken approach of basically isolating ourselves from reality. So the approach of Dharma is not about maintaining some seeds of good karma infinitely or sustaining some meditative absorption. If we were to subscribe to that approach, then you always have the paranoia that something is lurking. There is always unease. Such spirituality is to cover up that fundamental uneasiness or insecurity. In fact, this kind of pleasure-seeking spirituality is based on the underlying awareness of subtle pain. And your spirituality is an insurance policy. You're promised bliss and you're sealed off in an absolute equilibrium. You think you'll be free from fear in an ever-safe meditative state. But Buddhists ask the question, do we want to adopt that approach just because we want to avoid work, sex, and money? Or could we perhaps be free from the endless rat race of maintaining bliss to cover up our fundamental insecurity? Again, the question is, do we want to sustain this sort of ordinary, simplistic approach to spirituality, or do we want to basically uncover our natural innate awakening, be free altogether without the crutches of spirituality? This is actually a place where this is very interesting, because this is really this is really where you could say the analytical, skeptical, critically thinking intelligence that is, you could say, basic to the modern rejection of religion. This is actually where it connects with Buddhism, because it is actually, you could say, what we so often find in skeptics is that they reject this sort of, you could say, narcissistic project of religion as retreating into bliss. And so in the, you could say, hardcore Buddhist approach of actually just facing reality and being free, there is actually, you could say, an approach that is very much aligned with the modern rejection of all these crutches and the deception that's seen as intrinsic to religion. All of that is actually what we also are agreeing here. So you could say there's a place where there's an agreement. So actually in us, you could say, relating skillfully to our peers here in modernity, post-modernity, our atheist friends and so on, we actually have a common agenda in some way. The only thing is, and that's where we depart from a nihilism of just saying, well, this is all there is, normality, that we actually know the vision that we are approaching through the path of the Buddha is this dimension of our potential, the innate disposition of awakening. That, of course, is not, you could say, part of the vision within modern culture. But at the same time, some of the things that you could say in the middle way, and what Trungpa Rinpoche is proposing here, that we as practitioners need to overcome, these are also, you could say, objects of rejection by the modern skeptic. Okay, and that's a bit of an aside, but it's, I think, might be useful in our conversations with our, peers, friends, family. This dualism of good and bad has to be dealt with on ground level. We want to relate scientifically with all aspects of our reality, including body, speech, and mind. So the very notions of good and bad, they are based on ignorance. And we can't go beyond this if we still believe in them. Because ignorance is what constructs sense of me, and we're going to be talking quite a bit about this. Once there's me, then there's a dualism of what I like and what I don't like, what's perceived as good and bad. And we actually need to see what it is that constructs all of this. So we develop the vipassana, or the insight, to see through the foolishness of this game. We could say good karma versus evil karma. We're not proposing that you get into work, sex, and money to do the right thing. We're not sort of having a new, upgraded version of better work, better sex, and better money. That's not the point here. We are about transcending the cause of suffering. And this is the path of enlightenment. And the object here is not so much the work, sex, and money as eliminating ignorance, identifying how the nidanas develop and how we can reverse the process. It's about relating fully to our reality. It's mapping confusion, mapping awakening, and pursuing awakening. So we relate fully to our immediate reality, which generally we could say is constituted of our body, our speech, and our mind. That's pretty much what we're made up of. This is not metaphysical. This is very empirical. That's what we have. So these in and of themselves are not innately good or bad. They're not particularly spiritual. They're not particularly secular. It's like our breath. We don't say breath is very spiritual. We don't say it's very secular. It's neither. So it's very much about relating to what is there, straightforwardly, scientifically. So we could experience reality without the concepts of high and low. We could experience fully without, you could say, the overlaying optics of our conceptuality. We could experience the naked ground from where concepts arise. Of course, this is what's implicit in path of meditation and so on. So our experience of who we are, our identity, and then what comes with our identity, body, speech, mind. Once we begin to label it as me, and we begin to have all the dynamics around me, we have this conceptuality, good and bad. And that's where we construct or we think of ourselves in a particular manner. But the point here then is that we begin to relate to it more scientifically, spaciously, objectively, if you like. Clearly, we're letting go of these constructs, and we're being willing to suspend our traditional insecure footholds of conceptuality and directly experience basic space where these concepts originate and also settle into that space. This is a space that we sometimes refer to as the basic ground. And this can also be understood as the basic ground where bewilderment takes place. So it's only when we seek to maintain ourselves that we begin to then develop this language or methodology or footholding of conceptuality. So overall, just to be clear, when we're talking about bewilderment here and the confusion and delusion that originates with that and the concepts, we're simply just talking about, we're going down to the nidanas, and we're talking at this first place where we have bewilderment, where there's a sense of me versus the me's object. And then we begin to see like, I dislike, I like, I don't like. We avoid, we approach, all of these things. So with the practice of the path, we're continually trying to see through this delusion and the practice of this delusion. This is what we do with the practice of meditation. This is what we do with the practice of the paramitas. And what we're doing right now, even prior to the path itself, is beginning to understand, to have a vision, to understand what it is that needs to be done. Once we have that, when we know it needs to be, you could say, treated or remedied, then we begin with the path. Then we begin to practice the path of meditation. We begin to practice the path of integrating meditation in everyday life. So understanding how confusion takes place, we understand that we create patterns based on the idea of our person, our possessions, our relations. And those ideas arise from a basic bewilderment. To just be numb is not liberation. So we have these conventions we have these conventions that we operate with around ourselves. We label ourselves in a particular way, me. And we sometimes think, oh, if I don't really have an assertive, healthy ego, I might be run over. And that is such a misunderstanding. It's exactly this sense of self-centering that trips us up. So what we are proposing altogether is experimenting with actually being, not cheating reality, wholeheartedly embracing reality, and not needing to maintain some sort of patterns and so on. All of that comes from this unresolved bewilderment. And all of this pattern then is something that perpetuates suffering. So we want to get to the bottom of this, not just sort of in a sort of a way of, well, I'm neither happy nor sad sort of thing, being numb. That has nothing to do with awakening. You're not in equanimity just because you're not feeling anything. That has nothing to do with equanimity. It has nothing to do with anything except just basically leaving the cause of suffering latent, sort of untouched, really. So we would want to look at the source. Who is bewildered? Not finding anyone. We needn't cover up that naked experience. So if you've studied Madhyamika, or if you've come across what we call analytical meditation, there's a lot of looking at this assumption. The self that we take so seriously, we analyze, can we actually find anything? And we can't. In here, I would say you have a very pithy treatment of that. I'm just reading the paragraphs of Trungpa Rinpoche. this, in which he describes what it's about looking and not finding anything. We actually settle in that it's all right to have that naked experience. So it's not so much that we are just trying to patch up things. We're actually looking right at the source. There's a traditional image that when you throw a stone, if you throw it at a dog, which of course you shouldn't do, but it has been done sometimes, then dogs react by barking at the stone. If ever you were to throw a stone at a lion, the lion doesn't give a damn about the stone. The lion turns around and looks at who threw it. So that's what we're wanting to do here. We take the lion's approach. We look directly on what it is that we're experiencing as bewilderment, and we might actually worry that in looking we don't find anything, but actually that's all right. We are about seeing reality, and just because we don't find anything, that's actually all right. That is where we train ourselves in letting go of labels and patterns. We don't necessarily need to be so insecure and have a little hat and some credentials and, lapels and whatnot. We are actually willing to be there presently and having this naked experience, this direct experience of space. There's a gap, and that is particularly what we cultivate in the practice of meditation. There is a difference between bewilderment and confusion. To undo confusion, we have to go back to the original bewilderment. So we have then the original ground of bewilderment, delusion, you say being just unconscious. And from there, we try to label the experiences that we associate with this bewildered state where we then don't really know. And it's once we try to label these things that we have this confusion. This has to do with the development of the kleshas, the afflicted states of mind. And it's really it's that attempt to create an identity or attempt to make sense what is in fact just a confused, unconscious state. So we could say the initial bewilderment in itself doesn't necessarily have any ego. It's without self-consciousness. It's bewildered, it's unconscious, but you could say it exists prior to the then development of me. So once from that bewilderment, yes, then there's the attempt to sort of consolidate. But what we're then doing in terms of, you can say, addressing the original bewilderment is first beginning to undo the confusion. That is, of course, what we're doing with the path. There are flashes of our basic ground. Bewilderment is not as efficient as we might think. In meditation, we touch on the space beyond bewilderment. Here we get a panoramic glimpse. So bewilderment is not complete. It begins to sort of send out feelers and so on. That's where we begin to have this confusion. And with that confusion, then we begin to have little tantrums. But then again, we could also just leave the drama that comes with the confusion and all of that and begin to just experience the absence of this reactive pattern. That's what we do with the meditation. We actually train in forgetting to allow confusion, or allowing confusion to create its little tantrum. And from this perspective, we're above it all. There's a sense of not really being too touched by anything, including also work, sex, and money. But at the same time also, as we develop that sense of wider perspective, we also do, you could say, re-emerge from meditation and engage with the world. We engage in a dualistic way. And so we do, you could say, engage inevitably with, when we're not meditating, the world of work, sex, and money. And that's where we could actually have some sense of not being too caught up and actually bring some of our, you could say, peace that we have in meditation into our ordinary life. And this is what Trungpa Rinpoche refers to as a teeny weeny glimpse of awakening or of this light. So within such basic space, we have energy that's not necessarily caught up in karmic patterns. Relying on such energy, we don't need to panic. We are not directed by ego's game. So this is then, as practitioners, there is a beginning of experiencing some freedom from these patterns that ordinarily drive us. There is some energy that's not driven by ego. That is sometimes, this is not so, not being driven by ego, like it's not like all of a sudden we cease to exist. On the contrary, it's unleashing energy. And that actually is also where the terms such as tumo or chandali, you could say it is what the Buddhist, you could say, Buddhist practice of Kundalini yoga, but unfortunately Kundalini yoga nowadays is turned into some very fishy stuff. But there undoubtedly have been great yogis and undoubtedly still are great yogis within the Indian tradition, within the Buddhist tradition, and so on. There's authentic Kundalini yoga. But anyway, as far as the Tibetan tradition, Tumo and Chandali has not really been corrupted or sort of being sold as all sorts of strange things. And so what in the Buddhist tradition we refer to when we're talking about these things, Tumo, Chandali, we are talking about this inner intrinsic energy. And that energy is very sharp, it's compassionate, it's not centered on ego, and it allows us then to deal with the aspects of work, sex, and money. So it's not caught up in the ordinary karma of like and dislike, good and bad. So that is the energy of wakefulness, and this is something that has always been, but which we now possibly are more aware of, as something that permeates the situations of everyday life. So if we can rely on this kind of energy, it's something that guides without becoming part of a particular karmic pattern. So we don't need to be in doubt about what to do. We're not working with concepts of choosing this or that. We're not caught then in the game of ego. So that kind of ground, we might have flashes of it occasionally. Egolessness comes as momentary insights. These insights break ego's game. Now we can never have the experience of egolessness where we say, hey, I have egolessness. You never hear the Dalai Lama say that, right? I am egoless. Egoless is more that we see that this insecure attempt to secure our, you could say, reference points and so on, in the games of ego, it doesn't bring happiness. It trips us up. It brings suffering, and so the insecurity that drives that can be seen as being unnecessary. And the possibility that we needn't be caught by that doesn't prompt a new identity. It just prompts freedom from continuing this, you could say, unimaginative cycle. So we may at times experiencing being free or not having any reference point, and it could inspire us to work with our life, with work, sex, and money, because there's some sense of intuiting what actually is. So this is not something that we would have at all times, but it begins to become an inspiration of knowing what is real and seeing through the deceptions of ego. So from that point of view, all aspects of life begin to be seen as workable. They're not necessarily seen as being external to our path. They become expressions of sanity. You could say they're natural processes in our lives. Okay, I'll just see if there's any. Let's see what I'm doing for time. Yeah, I might go a little bit over time, but what's new? So here's a question. I'm wondering if there's a way to learn more about Vajrayana path and practices without a teacher. I'm open to the idea of having a teacher, just haven't found one yet. Vajrayana is very much about what lies beyond, you could say, the imagined. It's about what it lies beyond the linear, the rational. And as such, it's something that's communicated in a very human dimension. And that's where the teacher is important. It's not that there's a guild that requires that you have to sign up and have an authorized teacher. It's simply that the nature of Vajrayana is actually working with the Vipassana that lies beyond the grasp of the ordinary, you could say, deceived insecurity, the ordinary ignorance. And that's where you need a teacher from so many points of view, a teacher that sees the purity of the students and encourages that, cultivates it, nurtures it, and also sees the self-deception that takes place in the student. So from that point of view, the Vajrayana is so much, you could say, a situation of situated learning or apprenticeship. That being said, yes, it is. You could say it's a completely legitimate situation of not having a teacher. I mean, one should be very discerning. In the tantras, they would speak about spending a long time before settling on someone being one's teacher. So I think we can learn about the Vajrayana path and appreciate the theory, and you could say what's implied in it. And again, coming back to Chögyam Trungpa's authorship, Trungpa Rinpoche continually points to the Vajrayana. At the same time, while we're doing that, we can also look around. There are teachers who truly embody wisdom. Of course, I'm coming from one tradition where I can say I have experienced persons that have never deceived me, never let me down. So I'm very sort of, in terms of my own lineage, I can, you could say, guarantee. At the same time, my own teacher, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and also Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche, they were always very sort of encouraging people to look around, and they never really wanted to monopolize. And say, you should only study with us or our tradition. There's a sort of a Rime spirit, which means non-sectarian approach, that is very much about appreciating what's out there. So at the present time, then I would say it's wonderful to study the Vajrayana, and with that study then aspire that there may be a teacher who, you could say, could provide Vajrayana transmission. Then I may have thrown the teeny weeniest little tantrum today, actually, when a money issue came up with my partner and coincided poorly with my state of fatigue. Karmic patterns fully in gear. Curious to hear the guidance for those moments when we totally lose that space of wakefulness. We do panic and we act out of our frightened and confused minds. What to do next? Well, as Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche will always say, as long as we're aware of our shortcomings, then we're actually, you say, almost guaranteed to not be caught by them. So you could say the recognition, the humble recognition, and I can only nod in recognition. I have lots of teeny weeny tantrums daily myself, and so I'm completely aware of and also appreciative of those who sort of how do you say disclose their own shortcomings as practitioners, and I think that's a very important thing to do as practitioners. My own teachers, and you can listen to the Dalai Lama or Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche or Tsongtse Khyentse Rinpoche, so often they emphasize their own shortcomings. So I think that's a very good place to be on the path, the very sort of acknowledgement. In terms of what we do, well, I'm afraid it's back to the usual. There's need to, there's a need for calming down. There's a need for practicing ethics. There's need for the practice of meditation. And with that, then there is, then you could say, there's very much a part, there's very much a spirit that can do, this is workable. Particularly then for practitioners on the path, there is very much a sense that we set ourselves certain ideals, we fall short of them, and then we actually practice purifying that. We practice confession, we practice acknowledgement, we practice determination to be free of that, and gradually we sort of work towards it. One thing we should never do is be discouraged and then say, I give up. I'm not the perfect person I was supposed to be as a Buddhist, I'm giving up. The thing is, as Buddhists, we never ever assume that we're perfect. And so we're working with what is. And we might take one step forward and two back. We still take one step forward, and there might be one or two or three more steps forward. So gradually over time, we are improving. Overall, we live with a vision that our suffering and our confusion and our neurotic patterns are not basic to us. They're external to us. And so we work with them. This is, you could say, a cloth that might be somewhat stained, but it can be cleaned. So we don't give up on the cleaning process. Okay. Chapter 17. Panoramic awareness. So, we do not live in the future. We should not place our hopes there. Being present is without wishful thinking. It is anti-poverty. So, we might live with the hope that things will get better, or we might live being present in this reality, which is the Buddhist approach to remedying our suffering, as per actually we were just talking about. So suffering is not going to be resolved in the future when we are in some sort of perfect condition. What we are doing is working with what we are. Actually, I think it's Lenny Bruce who said, the truth is what is, not what should be. What should be is a dirty lie. And we're working with what is. That, being workable as it is an acknowledgement that is very much anti-poverty. It's very much about embracing the reality and seeing the workability of that. So it's free entirely from wishful thinking. Such a sense of being real, that we intrinsically are workable, could be called Tathagata. That is Buddha nature. It is beyond both extremes of fixating on it and also being nothing. Buddha nature is being awake, being here and present, I think it should just say being present where we already are. So when we are practitioners, there's a place of beginning to see that there's more than me and mine and all of that. And that kind of space, and so you could say intuiting of something that is simple, pure, is what we could call Tathagata or Buddha nature. So some people, they might say this is something real, and then they might sort of, you could say, objectify it, deify it, and so on. And others would say, no, there's a big problem in giving this kind of Tathagata some sort of face or some solid reality. And so they might say that we shouldn't sort of beginning to give it solidity, and that's what we call eternalism. Yeah, that's what very often is sort of the idea of deity and so on. Some might say, "Oh, that's eternalism," but then again, they might say it has no quality whatsoever, and that falls into nihilism. So, what we're doing here is, of course, beyond the two. This is familiar material from the middle way of the Madhyamaka refutations and discussions, abiding without conceptual reference points, such as it is or it is not, what we then call the extremes of eternalism and nihilism. So, of course, Buddha nature has nothing to do with that. It's not any kind of a attempt to find something we can hold on to. And certainly Buddha nature is not something about something that's pleasing or something that's shaped to fit the ego. Buddha nature is this vipassana. It's being awake, it's being present where we already are. And this, of course, is the foundation of the Vajrayana. The entire idea of deity, purity in the Vajrayana, mandala, and all of this has to do with the vipassana that lies beyond, you could say, eternalism and nihilism. Now, this nature of panoramic awareness is without good or bad. Yet panoramic awareness is restful. Here we can speak of meditation and action. So we don't need to push anything aside or hold on to anything. We have an overview. We call that panoramic awareness. It's not on the side of the good or the bad. As you could say, it accommodates either, but doesn't belong to either in any way also. So it's beyond the karmic chain reaction of good and bad. It's restful. It opens up, it brings spaciousness and a meditative presence. So that is what we can rely on, and that is what we can bring to our life. It's very, it's an all-rounder. One of my teachers referred to this as genes, I don't know if it still applies, but certainly in the 1980s, there was a sense that genes could actually be you could use it in a dressy situation, but it could also obviously be casual. And so genes could go anywhere. So I don't know if it still applies. I'm not up to date with you could say, I'm not authority on fashion, obviously. But panoramic awareness is something that goes everywhere. So it's something that we apply in meditation, but also in post-meditation. Panoramic is basically trust in the present. It possesses the wakefulness of Buddha nature. It is something that's unconditioned. So this is not something that is subject to affirmation or confirmation or whatever. It's not something we need to ask, is this it? Or how can we get it? And because that is the voice of poverty that wants something. It's the absence of wanting. It's the absence of having to have something or wondering even. So that panoramic awareness is then the abiding condition of Buddha nature. At least this kind of awareness has some sanity. It has some non-deceptive quality. And as such, you could say it's aligned with Buddha nature's wakefulness. The goodness of it, or the positivity of it, yes, we can say, but it's not really to do with good or bad. It's more that it's unconditioned. It doesn't rely on anything. That's actually what Nagarjuna he refers to as absolute truth. It is what is known as not relying on something else. Shenla Mateba. So panoramic awareness, and that lacking there's a typo there, I should say panoramic awareness, is faith in what is, as it is. It is sharp as we are not stuck in fixation. It heightens our sensitivity towards others. So panoramic awareness is not about keep on smiling, being positive. There's nothing that we need to defend. There's nothing we need to prove. It's just confidence in what is. And settling into this sharpens one's intelligence. There's nothing that we need to hold on to. There's nothing we can get stuck on. There's not an object that we can struggle with. It's not about us versus that or our job and so on, our situation. So this is what we then refer to as non-duality. Also, being less defensive or not caught up in our own circles of stories, our sensitivity to others is also heightened. We naturally develop compassion. It might seem too ordinary. It is something that is seen through being uncovered. It's not something that's cultivated. like the Garuda bird. So we might think that there has to be something more to awakening, something that we can sensationalize or that we can objectify as extraordinary, such as saying, oh, I have no thoughts and so on. But it's always been said that the secret of mind is seen as something that's too easy to be true. Mipa Rinpoche and other masters, they'll say it's like our eyelashes. They're so close that we don't notice them. So like the Garuda, which is supposedly the fledgling Garuda hatches fully grown and immediately can take off. This Buddha nature is already fully grown within us, and yet it still has to be hatched. But this nature does not require nursing. It proceeds spontaneously. We undo what veils Buddha nature through a process of unlearning. So once this nature is recognized, there's nothing to improve. It follows its own spontaneous unfolding without a grasper or a watcher. We don't objectify this nature. First, we undo the subjective grip of duality with panoramic awareness, and then the remaining experience of ordinary duality is also dissolved. So it's a process of undoing and unlearning rather than cultivating. This perspective is essential to understand what we call Buddha nature. So also again, this is, you could say Buddha nature is synonymous with what we call deity or mandala and so on, all the Vajrayana scope of seeing reality as it is rather than through, you could say, the narrow optics. Basic intelligence stabilizes naturally as when we wake up. Such awareness does not rely on anything. So we strengthen our experience of panoramic or basic awareness through continual recognition. It awakens by itself, just like when we wake up, dream and sleep naturally recede in the way they grip us. So we might think that our confidence needs to have something to sustain it, but this is where we need to realize that this nature is self-contained. It does not need any kind of crutches or support. We don't need to draw on something else. Our habitual confusion, ego, loses its basic occupation, and so it exhausts by itself. So we need to be disciplined in applying ourselves to the awake experience, which is the path of meditation. Seeing through our patterns is called shunyata. Within that, working with the energy, we have Mahamudra. Here we are comfortable and without worry, being fully in the situation. So when we talk about no longer sustaining habitual patterns and so on, that we don't need, that we can remain sort of without these kind of crutches and so on, yes, there's this idea that gradually ego loses its basic occupation. That is the general experience of shunyata. That is the general thrust of what we call the paramita vehicle, the sutra path. What is, however, then special about the Vajrayana, and this is the very, you could say, the danger of Vajrayana, or the subtle aspect of Vajrayana, and that is where it's so essential to have a teacher, is that we actually introduce this panoramic awareness. You could say there's an assertive aspect to this. So you could say the general shunyata is to leave aside. It's the negation of the need for ego, and it opens up for a great vipassana, which is then enhanced through the practice of the paramitas. But the Vajrayana path, operating also with, you could say, this introduction of panoramic awareness, is then, you could say, taking the result as the path, is then the approach of the Vajrayana, the Mahamudra approach, and that is then making Buddha nature into a path. So that is where we then are fully involved with the space, and yet it is contingent of the absence of self-consciousness altogether. So it's not objective knowledge of egolessness or emptiness alone, But it's also further a complete freedom from self-consciousness. And that is where the Vajrayana approach of integrating perceptions, integrating body, speech, and mind is so important. That is the key to then being one with the situation without a worry about being in balance or being, you say, deluded or not deluded. So this is sort of a key point, really, distinguishing the sutra and mantra vehicles. So here, there is no objectifying of experience or being overwhelmed by experience. With the insecurity of ego, the ground is overcrowded. Being overwhelmed means that there is still fixation on the other. And that is then being caught up or worried about being caught. There's an awkward sense of stupidity and a loss of sharpness. Of course, we need to have that, but in terms of, you could say, as an insurance against egomania and so on. But at the same time, also, there is this heaviness, lack of confidence, and so on. So that is where the practitioner then, through that, might actually get caught up in this self-consciousness around confusion. And that's where we then lose the practice or the sight of the openness of the ground, where we lose panoramic awareness. And that's where we can be overwhelmed by experiences. That is where we then are not seeing the ground as it is. It's overcrowded. So this is about, and if you look in the text here, I very much recommend this as a very helpful discussion about how we can go astray in such panoramic awareness and how we can lose perspective. That's something that's, the path is not just about us saying this is what we should do and this is what should happen, but in it happening, we also need to be very aware of where we could go astray. Irritation is to be taken as intelligent. We don't analyze it, however. Instead, we just feel we're there and we apply meditative wisdom, panoramic awareness. He says that's the whole point about meditation. You can be doing nothing but still remain brilliant. So again, this is not about, say, behavior. This is not about what to do. It's about what not to do, or you can say the wisdom of non-doing. So however much our ground might be overcrowded, we might be confused, our Buddha nature doesn't give up on us in the sense that even some discomfort that we might have, irritations that happen, they actually might be, you could say, messages. There might be something intelligent about it. We could even have a sense of humor about it, that it's somehow teaching us something. So there's more a question of needing to acknowledge and suppress. It's not about second guessing, analyzing, philosophizing. It's just actually taking it, feeling it. So we deal with it not through doing something, but through wisening up, which is what we do through meditative skill. We don't do anything except just this panoramic awareness, remaining with non-dual wisdom, brilliance. And this removes the speed, which becomes merely moving quickly, like rush hour. So it's okay, we might have to move quickly, we might be moving, but that's all right. We're not, essentially we're not moving, we're not doing. We're just moving, you know? There's just something, a lot happening. So we're not dismissing or resenting any situation. Our inspiration is our trust in our nature, who we are. This is the foundation for enlightened confidence or Vajra pride. Again, we are very much in the Vajrayana domain here. And in the Vajrayana, we're encouraged to recognize our Buddha nature and develop confidence in our innate reality, as we've described here. And we do this through the visualization of ourselves as a Buddha. The visualization itself is what we call samaya sattva. You know, if you're familiar with Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism, you see a lot of Buddhas, various kinds, And they're mainly what we call Sambhogakaya Buddhas. So these are the expressions of the qualities of enlightenment, the characteristic of enlightenment. It could be compassion, it could be wisdom, and so on. They're peaceful, wrathful, male, female, and so on. And all of these are embodiments of the qualities of enlightenment. But in the Vajrayana, as a means to recognize this basic panoramic wisdom that we possess, so much of the path is about integrating our experience of body, speech, and mind. So sadhana very much involves visualization, mantra, and so on. Now, all of that has to do, particularly the visualization, has to do with what we call our commitment, or our samaya sattva, the Buddha of commitment. But that is done in conjunction with also an awareness of its intangible nature, the wisdom of things as they are. And that's what we refer to as the jhana sattva, the Buddha of wisdom. So on one hand, we have the Buddha of commitment, we also have the Buddha of wisdom. This unity of visualizing ourselves as a Buddha and recognizing it as being who we truly are is the foundation for what we call Vajra pride, being that. Being what we are. We might visualize ourselves as a Buddha, but it's not something artificial. It comes with some certainty that this is what we truly are. And it, again, has nothing to do, it is based on the very recognition of no self and the, you could say, Mahamudra perspective of the, you could say, qualities that come with panoramic awareness. Vajrayana visualization of deity and mandala is not fantasy. Vajra pride is unconditional. So visualizations are not just fantasies, they are part of you. So the pride is believing in that part of you, recognizing that part of you. So here Rinpoche says if we have the potential for growing hairs, if we don't shave, then they just come by themselves. This is not about us being particularly wonderful because we can grow hairs. So likewise, there's nothing formidable about that we have Buddha nature. This you could say confidence or pride is not something that requires backing up or confirmation. It doesn't really need any credentials or relative reference points. We appreciate our purity, and we also appreciate the intrinsic purity of our world. So that is where we see ourselves as deity and the world as mandala. We might fear that we can't survive without relative reference points, but we also see that whenever we try to sustain that through the, you could say, karmic process of that's based on this insecurity of our confusion, it actually diminishes us. We can see we're going wrong. And we can also see how we blossom in letting go of these reference points. So this path has nothing to do with ego, has nothing to do with trying to mold things into our ego agenda. And that is where we could say, Vajrayana always says, if Vajrayana is used for the path of the ego, then we get something hits us. Vajra pride is not owned by ego. The well-being of the path comes from getting over ego. So such a vision might sound like a false enlightenment, but that's only if it's ruled by ego. If we use Vajra pride to suppress our insecurity and discomfort, it ceases to be Vajra pride. We might start out on the path on ego's conditions. I want to be glorious, I want to be enlightenment. But then again, as we progress through the path, we see the redundancy of this ambition and how we need to get over ourselves. And eventually we need to make jumps that are beyond our comfort zone. We choicelessly have to jump off some heights. We have to jump off some cliffs. Enlightenment is personal, beyond the concept of one and many. So us giving up our ego, jumping off, you could say, metaphorical cliffs, does not entail anything dangerous, but it's just awakening to a wider perspective. And that is very real. So there's very much the sense that we have identity, but it's, you could say, an identity that is less confined by insecurity. Even the Buddhas, if we read in the scriptures, you have sutras and tantras where the Buddhas will say, I, the Buddha, etc. So there are these then dimensions that have to do with that aspect of reality, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, Nirmanakaya, the aspects of, you could say, nature of reality, its character, the way its capacity, and so on. But it's not something that falls into the ordinary labeling. This is not something that is many different things. It's also not one thing. It's beyond these kind of concepts. Anyway, before we sort of speculate too much about enlightenment, we need to start where we are. Confusion is our starting point. Panoramic awareness is something that runs continually through our life. It's always present. We, on the path as practitioners, need to allow some gap and some spaciousness to draw inspiration. So when we talk about the Buddhist path in terms of wisdom, in terms of vipassana and so on, it's so much about not constructing anything but unveiling what is, seeing what there is. That's really all the Buddha said in terms of what he wanted us to do. He diagnosed our condition as curable, and the path really consists of just looking, seeing that this snake, in fact, is not a snake. It's just a striped rope. We have a cognitive dysfunction. It's not remedied by drugs or imagining that we're not cognitively dysfunctional, but rather just ridding ourselves of this hallucination, this dysfunctional condition, and looking properly. That is, you can say, the scope of the sage. And that is the scope of the sage's confidence. Without that, the sage would just be hanging on to credentials as everybody else. But this is the, you could say, unconditional beauty of the sage. That is why the sage is the master of not just samsara, but of nirvana, but also samsara. You take a sage, plonk them into Times Square or Trafalgar Square or wherever, and yes, they might not know the ins and outs, but they're sort of curious. They're happy to be there. They are at ease in the world. So we might see a difference between sitting meditation and ordinary life. And as far as our practice goes, this is very much lacking where we lack panoramic awareness. We need to have this quality of panoramic awareness with us at all times. And that is the inspiration in our life and in all the choices that we make. It's not so much something that we have to be grasped. It's more, Trungpa Rinpoche speaks of it more as a question of tuning into something. It's not that the answer is there. But that doesn't mean that we become rigid or anxious. It's just that we begin to allow some gap, some spaciousness where we can orient ourselves, gather inspiration and perspective. Appreciation of our basic awareness brings optimism and subtle confidence. We have a warrior's attitude towards life. Trungpa Rinpoche says, where there is basic faith and belief in one's wholesomeness, there is basic faith and belief in one's wholesomeness, in one's fundamental healthy situation. So our uncertainty, of course, naturally brings doubt and bewilderment, and that's the human condition. We continue to have that. But settling in this space of panoramic awareness begins to give us faith in that some insight can take place. We begin to have an optimistic perspective that nothing is that bad. There's some subtle confidence, and this gives us courage and also enables us, strangely enough, to do the right thing. Sometimes. Skillful action. So that's where we have the warrior's attitude towards life. Trungpa Rinpoche says, whatever happens, we always have a fundamentally positive quality about our experience of life. Such faith could be said to be the source of an almost magical performance. End of quote. So that confidence that things will work that actually makes it actually happen. And so the warrior's inspiration is based on not wishful thinking or hoping, but rather just in settling into this experience of what is panoramic awareness. So that seems to be the last word on the subject. And I'd like to, like I started off saying, please refer back to this work again and again. I believe it's very, very important. And I'd like to thank you for participating in this study. Okay, as I'm sitting here looking if there's any questions. There's some thank yous. So, of course, this is a dependent arising. So, if it wasn't for you guys out there, then this wouldn't happen. So, thank you very much. We share this. So, I guess what we should do then at the end then of this our common endeavor is share the merit, dedicate the merit. So. By this merit may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Ever absorbed in this display of divine forms and primordial awareness, appearance, sound, and perception, in the state of divinities, mantras, and dharmakaya, may I, inseparable from the practice of the profound and secret great yoga, attain within the essence of mind the state of one taste. So I guess that's the end of our journey for this time. I will, however, just mention that there'll be a study then commencing within the next month, which is then a study of, in fact, one of Trungpa Rinpoche's teachers, Chögyam Dilbu Khyentse Rinpoche. If you read, I think it's in page 452 or something, Born in Tibet, in one of the old editions. There's a very beautiful description of his meeting with Dilbu Khyentse Rinpoche when he was very young, and throughout Trungpa Rinpoche's life, and he and Dilbu Khyentse Rinpoche were very, very close. And in fact, when Trungpa Rinpoche passed away, it was also Dilbu Khyentse Rinpoche who presided over the cremation, and also, you could say, passing on transmissions to the Sangha that was left behind. Anyway, this is a study of the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva, which is a pith instruction of the Mahayana. And we've been discussing Vajrayana here today. And of course, this heart of compassion, bodhicitta, is what lies at the core of the Vajrayana. So I hope that you'll be able to join. And that's it. Thanks again.